The historians who are most skeptical about Jesus agree on almost nothing. They disagree about whether he performed miracles. They disagree about whether he rose from the dead. They disagree about whether he thought of himself as divine. They disagree about the reliability of the gospel accounts, about which sayings are authentic and which were invented by later communities, about the relationship between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. But they agree on this. Something happened in first century Galilee that changed the world. A man was born in an occupied territory on the eastern edge of the Roman Empire. He grew up in a village so small and so insignificant that when one of his future followers was told he came from there, the response was, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" He had no formal education in the sense that the educated world of his time would have recognized. He wrote nothing. He commanded no army. He held no political office. He owned nothing of material value. He was executed as a criminal at approximately 33 years of age, abandoned by most of his followers, buried in a borrowed tomb. And within 3 centuries, the empire that executed him had adopted his name as its official religion. Within 5 centuries, more human beings on Earth claimed to follow him than any other single figure in history. Within 2,000 years, more words had been written about him than about any other human being who has ever lived. How? That is the question this video is actually about. Not the theological question of who Jesus was in relation to God, which is a question that the evidence cannot settle and that different traditions have answered differently for 2,000 years. The historical question of who Jesus of Nazareth was as a human being, what he actually said and did and experienced, what his world looked like from the inside, what it felt like to be him moving through the specific landscape of first century Galilee and Judea. Because the Jesus that most people carry in their heads, whether they are believers or skeptics, is a figure that has been so thoroughly processed through 2,000 years of theological interpretation, artistic representation, cultural appropriation, and institutional religion that the historical human being has almost entirely disappeared behind his own image. And when you try to recover that human being, when you strip away the halo and the stained glass and the doctrinal formulas and the centuries of sermon and ask who this person actually was in the world he actually inhabited, what you find is considerably more interesting, more strange, more politically explosive, and more humanly compelling than anything the tradition has usually been willing to show you. Welcome to this channel, where ancient secrets meet modern questions. To see the life of Jesus as you have never seen it before, you need to start not with the Gospels, but with the world. Because Jesus did not descend into an abstract theological space. He was born into a specific place at a specific time with specific economic conditions and specific political tensions and specific religious controversies that shaped everything he said and did. And most of those conditions have been almost entirely invisible to readers of the Gospels across most of Christian history. The world Jesus was born into was an occupied world. The Roman Empire had controlled Judea directly or indirectly since 63 BCE, when the Roman general Pompey entered Jerusalem and walked into the Holy of Holies in the temple, an act of desecration that the Jewish people never forgot and never forgave. By the time Jesus was born, the client king of the Jews was Herod the Great, a man of extraordinary administrative and architectural ability and extraordinary personal brutality, who had built the most magnificent version of the Jerusalem temple the world had ever seen, while simultaneously murdering members of his own family, including several of his sons and his own wife, Mariamne, when he suspected them of plotting against him. The Gospel of Matthew's account of Herod ordering the massacre of infant boys in Bethlehem to eliminate a potential rival Messiah is an event that does not appear in any other ancient source. Historians debate its historicity. But it is entirely consistent with what we know about Herod's character. This was a man who, according to the first century historian Josephus, ordered that prominent Jewish leaders be rounded up and killed at the moment of his own death, specifically so that there would be mourning in Judea rather than celebration. Herod the Great is the political world into which Jesus was born. And knowing that changes how you hear everything that follows. The Galilee where Jesus grew up was not the peaceful pastoral landscape of most Christian imagination. It was a region that had been violently reconquered and forcibly re-Judaized by the Hasmonean rulers approximately a century before Jesus' birth. The population was diverse, the religious traditions were varied, and the region sat at the intersection of multiple trade routes that brought it into contact with the full complexity of the Hellenistic world. The scholar Sean Frayne of Trinity College Dublin, who devoted his career to the historical geography of Galilee, argued that understanding Jesus requires understanding Galilee as a place of extraordinary social and cultural complexity, far from the simple rural backwater of popular imagination. Nazareth, where Jesus grew up, was a village of perhaps a few hundred people at most. It sat on a hillside overlooking the Jezreel Valley, and just over that hillside, clearly visible from the hills above Nazareth, was one of the most striking features of the first century Galilean landscape, the city of Sepphoris. Sepphoris was a major Roman administrative center, a fully Hellenized city with a theater and colonnaded streets and all the apparatus of urban Greco-Roman civilization. And it was being massively rebuilt during the years of Jesus's childhood and young adulthood. Here is something that almost nobody who reads the Gospels in a modern context knows. The Greek word that the Gospels use for Jesus's trade, the word translated as carpenter, is tekton. And a tekton in the ancient world was not simply a woodworker in the sense of someone who made furniture. A tekton was a skilled craftsman who worked in wood and stone and who would have been employed in exactly the kind of major construction projects that were happening in Sepphoris during Jesus' youth. The scholar John Meyer of Notre Dame, in his monumental 4-volume work, A Marginal Jew, which is the most exhaustive and the most historically rigorous study of the historical Jesus ever produced, argues that Jesus and his father Joseph almost certainly worked in Sepphoris during the years of its reconstruction, which means that the Jesus who began his public ministry had spent years working in a fully Hellenized Roman city surrounded by the full apparatus of Greco-Roman culture in a context completely different from the village of Nazareth where he had been raised. This is not a minor detail. It means that Jesus was not a simple rural peasant who had never encountered the wider world. He had worked within it. He had seen the Roman administrative apparatus up close. He had encountered the full spectrum of the social hierarchy of the ancient world, from the wealthy patrons who commissioned public buildings to the laborers at the bottom of the construction hierarchy. And all of that encounter fed into the teaching that was coming. The world Jesus grew up in was also a world of profound economic inequality and social stress. The historian Richard Horsley of the University of Massachusetts, who has spent a career analyzing the social and economic conditions of first century Galilee, has argued that the region was experiencing significant economic disruption in the period of Jesus' youth, driven by the combination of Roman taxation, Herodian taxation, temple taxation, and the general disruption of traditional village economies by the expansion of commercial agriculture. The peasant farmers of Galilee were not living in prosperity. Many of them were losing their land to debt, becoming tenant farmers on land their families had owned, or being driven into the cities as day laborers. This economic context illuminates Jesus' teaching in ways that the tradition has often failed to acknowledge. When Jesus tells the parable of the prodigal son, the detail that the son ends up feeding pigs is not merely a colorful story element. It describes the specific degradation of a Jewish young man who has lost everything and is doing work that was ritually defiling, work that only someone with no other options would accept. When Jesus tells the parable of the workers in the vineyard, the detail of men standing in the marketplace all day waiting to be hired is a precise description of the day labor market of first century Galilee. Men who had no land and no security and who depended on being chosen each morning for work that might not come. When Jesus says that his followers should not worry about food and clothing, he is not speaking to people who have plenty of both. He is speaking to people for whom food and clothing are genuine daily concerns. Understanding this economic context also illuminates why Jesus attracted the following he did. The people who responded most enthusiastically to his message were not the comfortable. They were the economically marginal, the ritually excluded, the people whom the social and religious hierarchies of first century Judea had placed at the bottom. The tax collectors were not merely morally suspect. They were collaborators with the Roman occupation who had purchased the right to collect taxes and who made their living by extracting more than what was owed. Their social exclusion was total. The prostitutes were not merely morally condemned. They were economically desperate women who had no other options in a world that offered women almost no economic alternatives. The lepers were not merely physically ill. They were ritually excluded from the community in a way that meant complete social isolation. These are the people Jesus ate with. These are the people he touched and healed and called and included. And understanding who they were in their world makes his choice to associate with them considerably more radical than it appears in the abstract. Now let us follow Jesus through the specific sequence of events in his public ministry, because the sequence matters and has been largely invisible to readers who encounter the gospel accounts as a collection of sayings and miracle stories without a sense of their historical logic. Jesus' public ministry began in the wilderness, not metaphorically. He went to the Jordan River, where John the Baptist was conducting a movement of immersion and repentance that was drawing crowds from across Judea and Galilee. John's movement was, by any historical assessment, politically explosive. He was calling the entire people of Israel to a new beginning, to a symbolic recrossing of the Jordan, a new exodus, a new entry into the promised land. He was implicitly saying that the existing religious and political order was not legitimate, that Israel needed to start over. And he was doing this with remarkable success, drawing crowds that the Herodian establishment found alarming enough to eventually arrest and execute him. Jesus submitted to John's baptism. This is one of the most historically certain facts about Jesus' life, because it is the kind of fact that the early Christian tradition would have had every reason to suppress or explain away, since it implies that Jesus was subordinate to John, or needed the repentance that John's baptism represented, or both. The fact that all four Gospels preserve this event in some form, despite its theological awkwardness, is strong evidence that it actually happened. Jesus began his public life by identifying himself with a movement of radical renewal that was, from the perspective of the established order, politically and religiously subversive. After the baptism and a period in the wilderness, Jesus returned to Galilee and began his own ministry. And the characteristic form that ministry took was different from anything that had preceded it in the Jewish religious landscape. He did not establish himself in Jerusalem, the center of religious power. He did not align himself with any of the established religious parties, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes. He moved constantly, village to village across Galilee, teaching in synagogues and in the open air, eating in people's homes, gathering a following that was mobile and itinerant rather than settled and institutional. The movement Jesus built was not an organization. It was a practice. It was the practice of eating together, of sharing meals across the boundaries that the social and religious hierarchies of the time used to define who was in and who was out. The scholar Marcus Borg of Oregon State University, whose work on the historical Jesus combined rigorous scholarship with remarkable accessibility, argued that the table fellowship of Jesus was the most politically and socially radical aspect of his ministry. In a world where who you ate with was a precise statement of social status and religious purity, Jesus' practice of eating with tax collectors and sinners and Pharisees and women of questionable reputation was not merely a personal gesture of openness. It was an enacted proclamation that the kingdom of God operated by different rules than the social hierarchy of the existing world. The miracles are the most historically contested dimension of Jesus' ministry, and it is worth being honest about what historical scholarship can and cannot say about them. What the historical evidence clearly shows is that Jesus had a reputation as a healer and an exorcist that was so widespread and so well attested, even by his opponents, that it cannot be explained away as later Christian invention. The Talmud, which is not a source friendly to Jesus, preserves traditions that describe him as a sorcerer who led Israel astray, a description that implies he was doing something that his opponents could not deny. The historian John Meyer argues that the miracle tradition is so early and so multiple attested that the historical Jesus was almost certainly someone whose contemporaries experienced and described extraordinary healings in his presence, whatever the ultimate explanation for those experiences might be. What those healings meant in their social context is as important as the question of their historical occurrence. In first century Judea, physical illness was not merely a medical condition. It was frequently a social and ritual condition as well. A leper was not only sick, he was excluded from the community, required to warn others of his approach, unable to participate in the religious and social life of his people. A woman with a hemorrhage was in a state of permanent ritual impurity that prevented her from touching others without transmitting that impurity. A blind man or a lame man was frequently excluded from the temple precincts. When Jesus healed these people, he was not merely restoring their physical health. He was restoring their place in the community, their access to the religious and social life from which their condition had excluded them. The healing miracles are, in their social dimension, acts of inclusion and restoration as much as acts of physical cure. The exorcisms deserve separate attention because they have been almost entirely privatized and spiritualized in the popular Christian imagination in a way that strips them of their political dimension. In the first century Jewish world, demon possession was not merely a personal spiritual crisis. It was understood as a manifestation of the disorder that the forces opposed to God had introduced into the creation. When Jesus cast out demons, he was not merely helping troubled individuals, he was enacting the defeat of the powers that held the creation in disorder. The exorcisms were in the framework of first century Jewish apocalyptic theology, evidence that the kingdom of God was arriving and the powers of the age were being displaced. The most extraordinary of the exorcisms in the gospel accounts, the exorcism of the Gerasene demoniac in Mark 5, is a story that becomes almost unintelligibly powerful when you read it in its political context. A man is living among the tombs, uncontrollable, cutting himself, crying out. Jesus asks the demon its name. The demon answers, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Legion, the Latin word for a Roman military unit of approximately 6,000 soldiers. The demon that has taken possession of this man and driven him to the tombs, to the place of death, has named itself after the Roman occupation. And Jesus drives it into a herd of pigs, which charge down the hillside and drown in the sea. The political symbolism is so dense and so specific that it cannot be accidental. Whatever was happening in that story at the historical level, the narrative as it has been preserved is a story about the defeat of the occupying power and the restoration of the human being whom that power had reduced to a life among the dead. The turning point of Jesus' ministry came at Caesarea Philippi, a city that was itself a statement of Roman power, built by Philip the Tetrarch and named in honor of Caesar Augustus. It was here, in the shadow of a massive rock face decorated with temples to the god Pan, that Jesus asked his disciples the question that the entire gospel narrative has been building toward. Who do people say I am? And then, who do you say I am? And Peter answered, You are the Messiah. And Jesus immediately told them to tell no one and began to talk about suffering and death. This sequence is one of the most psychologically and historically complex in the entire gospel tradition. The disciples have reached the conclusion that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus does not deny it, but he immediately redefines what Messiah means in a direction that none of them expected and none of them was prepared to accept. The Messiah, in his redefinition, is not the warrior king who will defeat Rome and restore the Davidic monarchy. The Messiah is the one who will suffer and be rejected and killed and rise on the third day. And Peter, who has just confessed Jesus as the Messiah, immediately rebukes him for this redefinition, and Jesus responds with the most startling rebuke in the gospel: "Get behind me, Satan." Peter's understanding of messiahship was not wrong in its own terms. It was the standard understanding grounded in the prophetic tradition. Jesus' rejection of it is not a correction of a mistake. It is a fundamental reorientation of the entire category, a claim that the messianic path goes through suffering rather than triumph, through death rather than victory, in a direction that the entire Jewish tradition had not anticipated and that the disciples could not process. The journey to Jerusalem that follows this exchange is, in all three synoptic gospels, deliberately paced and deliberately ominous. Jesus is not rushing. He is teaching as he goes, and his teaching on the road to Jerusalem is specifically about death and service and the reversal of the world's values. The disciples argue about who is greatest, and Jesus tells them that the greatest must be the servant of all. James and John ask for the seats of honor in the kingdom, and Jesus asks them if they can drink the cup he is going to drink. The journey to Jerusalem is a journey towards something that Jesus knows is waiting and that his disciples cannot yet bring themselves to understand. The entry into Jerusalem on a donkey is a deliberate prophetic act, a conscious enactment of the prophecy in Zechariah 9-9, "Your king comes to you, humble and riding on a donkey." It is a claim to messianic identity expressed in a specific prophetic language that his Jerusalem audience could read. It was also a political provocation, a public claim to the title King of the Jews in the city where the Roman governor and the high priestly establishment maintained their power. In the week of Passover, when Jerusalem was packed with pilgrims and political tension was at its annual peak. The action in the temple followed, and then the days of controversy in the temple precincts, the debates with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes, the increasingly explicit confrontations with the Jerusalem establishment, the apocalyptic discourse on the Mount of Olives predicting the temple's destruction. And then the Last Supper, which the Synoptic Gospels place on the night of Passover. At a meal that was itself already saturated with the memory of liberation, the exodus from Egypt, Jesus took the bread and the wine and reinterpreted them as his body and his blood, as the elements of a new covenant being established through his coming death. The disciples ate and drank without fully understanding what they were participating in, and then they went to the garden. Gethsemane is the most humanly revealing moment in the entire gospel tradition. Jesus prays, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." The Luke account adds, "And his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground." This is not the prayer of a being who is serenely certain of the outcome. This is the prayer of a human being facing death with the full weight of human fear and human dread, asking if there is another way and accepting that there is not. The arrest, the trials, the crucifixion, the Roman form of execution reserved for slaves and political rebels, designed to maximize humiliation and suffering and serve as a public deterrent, conducted in the most public possible way outside the city walls at a place the Gospels call Golgotha, the place of the skull, the inscription on the cross, the King of the Jews, Rome's final mockery of a messianic claim it had just executed. The cry from the cross in Mark and Matthew, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The opening verse of Psalm 22, a psalm that begins in desolation and ends in vindication. Whether Jesus was quoting the psalm as a whole, trusting in its ultimate resolution, or whether this was a cry of genuine abandonment, is a question that the tradition has never resolved and probably cannot resolve. And then the death, and the burial in a tomb that did not belong to him, and the silence of Saturday, which the gospel accounts pass over almost entirely. The silence of a community whose hope had been executed and buried and sealed behind a stone. What happened on Sunday morning is the claim that the entire tradition is built on, and the claim that historical evidence alone cannot settle. The tomb was found empty. The risen Jesus appeared to the disciples and to others. The community that had been scattered by the crucifixion was transformed within weeks into a movement of extraordinary courage and conviction that would eventually change the world. Whether the resurrection was a physical, historical event, a spiritual experience of the disciples, a theological claim about the significance of Jesus' death, or something else entirely, is a question that the evidence cannot resolve, and that different traditions and different scholars have answered differently for 2,000 years. What the historical evidence does show is that something happened. The disciples who had fled and denied and hidden were transformed. The community that should have dissolved after the execution of its leader became instead the most rapidly growing religious movement in the ancient world. The cross, which was a symbol of shame and criminal death, became the central symbol of a movement that spread from Jerusalem to Rome within a single generation. Something happened. And the argument about what that something was is the argument that has been driving the history of Western civilization for 2,000 years. Here is what the historical investigation of Jesus' life reveals that the theological tradition has often obscured. Jesus was fully embedded in the specific world of first century Galilee and Judea, in its economics and its politics and its religious controversies and its social hierarchies. He was not floating above that world in serene theological abstraction. He was in it, shaped by it, responding to it, challenging it from within it. The things he said and did made sense to the people who heard him in ways that require knowing that world to understand. And when you understand that world, the things he said and did are considerably more radical, more politically explosive, and more humanly challenging than the domesticated version that 2,000 years of institutional religion has usually presented. He ate with the wrong people. He touched the untouchable. He told the powerful that their power was temporary and the weak that their vindication was coming. He walked toward his own death with a clarity and a purpose that his disciples could not understand and that his opponents could not prevent. He died abandoned and mocked and in agony. And then, according to the tradition that carries his name, the story did not end there. Whether you believe what happened next or not, the life that preceded it is one of the most extraordinary human lives ever lived, not because of the theology that has been built around it, because of what the man himself actually said and did and was in the specific world he actually inhabited, among the specific people he actually chose to spend his time with: the poor, the sick, the excluded, the despised, the ones the world had decided did not matter. He decided they did. And the world has never fully recovered from that decision.